Mautner
Hey y'all, Dave here. Welcome to my main channel where I mostly talk about things like philosophy and atheism. And welcome to the fourth video discussing the topic of personal identity. In the previous three videos, we discussed some thought experiments and concepts that are helpful in thinking about personal identity, as well as hinting at some of the ideas that personal identity is important too. However, as mentioned in the last video, we haven't actually discussed what personal identity actually is, or why it's important, though you've probably already worked out why it's important and what it's important to. In this video, we're going to explore what personal identity is a little bit deeper, as well as some of the other issues that connect to it, along with explaining some of the terminology that you'll encounter in future videos when we discuss the ideas of John Locke, David Hume, and Derek Parfit. Let's start with a definition of personal identity, at least as it relates to philosophy anyway. The best place to start with any definition is usually a dictionary. In this case, we're going to start with the Dictionary of Philosophy from Penguin Reference. According to that, personal identity is defined as what is it for a person to exist over time. It goes on to list a lot more than that, as it goes on to discuss various ideas from various philosophers, but this is the important part of what it lists, as it gets it to the heart of what personal identity philosophy is. Let's take a look at the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy next, which lists personal identity as the problem is that of what makes the identity of a person at a time or through time. To take the latter first, we can each imagine ourselves as having been rather different or as becoming rather different, as indeed we will in the normal course of life. What makes it the case that I survive a change? That it is still me at the end of it. As with the Penguin book, the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy goes on to discuss various ideas from various philosophers. So I have taken out the most relevant parts for this video. As you can see, both dictionaries basically describe it as what makes a person them over time. Let's just go with one more reference here, this time with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. According to the SEP, personal identity deals with philosophical questions that arise about ourselves by virtue of being people, or as lawyers and philosophers like to say, persons. So let's simplify that a little bit. Personal identity, in a broader sense, deals with philosophical topics about what makes you, well, you, and all the things associated with that. In a narrower sense, it can refer to what makes you the same you over the span of time. Think of what was discussed in the previous videos and the kinds of questions that we asked. In the Ship of Theseus video, we looked at questions about whether replacing parts in the Ship of Theseus meant that it was no longer the Ship of Theseus, or the same Ship of Theseus that returned from his travels and docked in Athens. We asked questions about sameness and what made it the same ship or whether it was a different ship, along with similar questions about the janitor's mop, the couple's tree, and lock socks. Even what makes me, Dave Mark Rowlands, the same Dave Mark Rowlands as I was during various stages of my development. Here we see questions about the persistence of identity over time and through changes. With the previous video, we looked at some of the thought experiments that come from John Locke in his work and essay concerning human understanding. We talked about a drunk and a sober man, and Socrates and the mayor of Queensborough, along with the prince and cobbler. These got us thinking about what made the person, well, them. What are the qualities that go into making those people those particular people? This is what personal identity deals with. The qualities of the person that make them who they are, both at a particular moment in time, as well as over the span of their life. And it is these questions that this series of videos has been exploring, and will explore in future entries in the series. It's probably obvious to you why these questions are important. The SEP entry kind of hints at it, but let's explore a couple of things that personal identity relates to, to and are important to understanding. But before doing that, let's look at a related term that you'll find if you read the literature on personal identity. Something that you'll see show up in the literature on the topic of personal identity is that it is a forensic concept. John Locke describes it this way in an essay concerning human understanding. It means pretty much what you probably think it means, but just to give it a bit of clarity, according to the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, forensic means pertaining to or connected with courts of law, along with the point of describing something as a person or finding that the same person was present on two different occasions is essentially the attribution of responsibility, which gives us a pretty good indication of why personal identity is an important concept. It has legal implications. When we prosecute someone, we want to make sure that the correct person is being prosecuted. This sounds simple enough, what with things like DNA evidence and so forth. But as you'll see later, this is slightly more complicated than it sounds. Some of the thought experiments from the previous videos might give you some indication of that, but we'll cover it in more detail later on in this and other videos. The idea that it being a forensic concept means that it is about the attribution of responsibility, also means that it is an important concept in ethics. It relates to things like praiseworthiness and blameworthiness of actions, and what is known as desert, or getting what is deserved. Let's take a look at a couple of these ideas in slightly more detail, beginning with the legal side of things. When it comes to charging someone for a crime, we want to make sure that we have the right person. That's a pretty simple thing, right? A person commits a crime, we find the evidence, we charge them, and a jury convicts them if the evidence is strong enough.
Simples.
And yeah, that's pretty much how it works in most cases. Most crimes are committed, investigated, and solved in a reasonable time, and with modern technology. What about crimes committed in the past, though? One of the popular examples of a problem case here is that of the Nazi. We are usually given the example of a guard who was a young man when they committed their horrific crimes, but who is old now. Someone who was a victim of their violence spots them and accuses them of being the perpetrator of horrific violence against them. We have nothing like DNA evidence to link them to the crimes, nor do we have paperwork. The Nazi has undergone significant changes between then and now, perhaps changing their name. Many of their physical features have changed. Maybe even their personality has changed significantly. The question of whether they are the same person they were then is an important question to the justice that should be given to the victim of the Nazis' horrific crimes, and in a far more controversial sense, the Nazi themselves. This can be further complicated by another notion. What if the Nazi had developed dementia? Or what about a serial killer who is discovered through the use of genealogy databases? The serial killer committed vicious crimes all through the 1970s and 80s, but is not discovered until 2020 through genealogy databases. There is DNA evidence that links the person to the crimes, however, it is discovered that the person found in 2020 has dementia. He has no memory of who he is or the day before, let alone any memory of the crimes he committed 40 to 50 years ago. Is he still the same person that committed the crimes? Would it be just to try him and convict him for those crimes? Would it be just to try the Nazi in the same circumstances? Think about some of the answers that you thought of when watching the Ship of Theseus video, or the Lockean Thought Experiments video. Would the answers you gave to those lead you to trying the Nazi or the serial killer for the crimes? Or would you prosecute them? And if so, why would you prosecute them? As you can see, personal identity over time is an important philosophical concept when it comes to justice and legality. And hopefully you can see why this is an important puzzle. This idea also probably gives you some indication for why it's important to the next thing it is connected to: ethics. So, in the near future, I'm going to do a series of videos like this one, discussing ethics. I'm still trying to decide between doing a philosophy of religion series first, or a series on ethics first. If you have a preference for one or the other, then just let me know in the comments and I'll go by that. I'm sure most of you watching this will have an idea of what ethics is, but I'll give a brief description of it here. According to the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, ethics is the study of the concepts involved in practical reasoning, good, right, duty, obligation, virtue, freedom, rationality, and choice. To simplify it in a way that most people see it, ethics is about right and wrong. Some people call that morality and see ethics in a different way, and some people see ethics and morality as synonymous. As you can see from the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, ethics does involve those ideas and is about those things. But those things also include ideas like duty and obligation. And from these things, you can probably see why something like personal identity is an important concept to ethics. Some of them for the same reasons that were just mentioned about legality. Let's take obligation as an example here. Consider a scenario where person A, we'll call them Todd, has borrowed money from person B, who we'll call Frank. Todd has borrowed 500 quid from Frank, and Todd has agreed to pay Frank back in 6 months. We would probably agree that an obligation has been created between Todd and Frank, and that Todd should pay Frank back in 6 months. This obligation means that Todd would commit a wrong against Frank if he was to not pay him back in this specified time frame. There could be extenuating circumstances that mean Todd may not be wrong, but we'll just consider this to be under regular circumstances. What if the only fact that was different was that Todd had legally changed his name to Ted? Would Todd now being Ted mean that the moral obligation to pay Frank back no longer counted? Most of us would probably agree that the name change doesn't remove that obligation, either morally or legally. After all, Ted still seems to be the same person as Todd. They are just identified differently. Ted would still be committing a wrong against Frank by not paying him back. If Todd changed his name to Ted in the hopes of escaping the obligation, we would probably count that as a moral wrong too. However, imagine now that Todd has been the victim of a hit-and-run accident a few months before he was due to pay Frank back. Todd spends a month in a coma, and when he comes out, he has completely lost his memory. Todd spends a few months relearning much of what he has learned over his life during his recovery, though he never regains the memory of making that obligation with Frank. Is Todd still under an obligation to pay Frank back? Does the fact that Todd has no memory of making this obligation or borrowing the money mean that the obligation has been dissolved? If it does dissolve it, then why does it dissolve it? And if the opposite is true, then why is the opposite true? As I mentioned at the end of the section on legality, think of the answers that you gave to the ship of Theseus and the Lockean thought experiments. How well do they gel with your responses to the Todd and Frank case? Do they remain coherent with the responses you gave, or are there tensions in them? Anyway, I'll wrap this one up here. Hopefully you have a basic idea of what personal identity means in the scope of this series of videos, and the kinds of questions we'll be exploring in the forthcoming videos in this series, as well as why personal identity is an important question in philosophy. In this one I mentioned its connection to legality and ethics, but it connects to many other questions and concepts, including personhood itself. While I have not mentioned personhood here, it will be mentioned in a future video. I'm trying to keep these videos small and reasonably bite-sized. Even if it won't be possible for all of them, I'm trying to keep them both informative and digestible. In the next video, we'll begin exploring John Locke's argument for personal identity from his work that I've mentioned a couple of times already, an essay concerning human understanding. You may have noticed a link to it in the references of a previous video, but I'll leave a link to it in this one too, just in case you want to read it yourself. If you are interested, the relevant section is called Of Identity and Diversity. Feel free to read the whole section, but we'll be focused on Chapter 11, Personal Identity and onwards. The next video will probably be a little bit longer. Anyway, until the next time, take care, As always, if you found the video helpful or informative, then don't forget to leave a like, or share if you think it might be helpful or informative to others. If you feel like leaving me a subscribe, then that would be really appreciated. It's incredibly helpful for a small channel like mine. I also have a Patreon and PayPal link in the description if you want to help me out a little bit as a struggling philosophy enthusiast and communicator. See you soon. I hope life treats you well. Until then, bye.